What did you make of that? Okay, a series on parables. I thought, well, you've spent a lot of the year with the Apostle Paul and the second letter to the Corinthians, and we looked at Isaiah for a few weeks. Now into the Gospels and a little bit about parables, and I'll just tell you where I'm going. Thank you. I'll start again. Good morning, everybody. I'll just tell you as a sort of pre-introduction, if you see what I mean, where we'll go over these next few weeks so you can maybe think, oh yeah, I'll be interested to read about that first. So next week I've called a fair pay for a day's work, and it's that parable in Matthew chapter 20, which is sometimes rather boringly called the workers in the vineyard, because the parable is anything but boring. So that's Matthew 20. And then the following week, I've called it the Midnight Visitor, which is one you'll recognize. Often in the Bible, the heading is called Friend at Midnight, and that's about prayer. It comes straight after the Lord's Prayer. It's in Luke 11, and it's just a few verses, verse 5 to verse 8. The following week, you're spared of me because it's Super Sunday, and I hope you'll all be here that day. And then the 31st of August, I've entitled Dress Properly, and that's one of the wedding banquet parables. I've taken the one from Matthew chapter 22, which is similar to the one in Luke 14, but it has quite an interesting twist at the end of it. So that's where we're going. And today I've called Employee of the Month. I've put a question mark after it because clearly nobody's going to give this fellow an award for what he's done. But it is a puzzling parable, and the reason I chose it first is that I think it's the most difficult parable that Jesus ever told. So I thought we'd start with the hardest, and there's been an awful lot written to try and interpret exactly what it is that Jesus is trying, the message that Jesus is trying to get over, because at first glance, if you're not careful, it sounds as if Jesus is condoning dishonesty. If you look at it more carefully, you'll find out that he's not. But it's something that's puzzled people for a long time. So, what do you make of a phrase like, use your worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that, it's verse 9, when it is gone, you'll be welcomed into eternal dwellings. What do you do with that one? Well, let me start. Suppose a bank manager was about to lose his job because he'd been accused of mismanagement of the bank's funds, and so he went round, and all the influential people that had a housing loan or a bank loan, he reduced all their loans of his own bat and decided he would do that so that they would think well of him, and probably he would at least have friends who would look after him because he was losing his income. Or what about the university professor, the head of department, the university who's about to be replaced by some young enthusiastic academic who can do the job better than he can, so he's about to lose his job as well. So what he does, he gives out a whole bunch of high distinctions and hopes that this will find him favors, if not with the students themselves, certainly with their parents. Now, I don't know if those scenarios are even possible in today's age of accountability, but it's a way of saying this is the sort of thing that's happening in this story here. And as I say, I've called it Employee of the Month. I've put the question mark there because, as I say, clearly this guy isn't in the running for any sort of award. So what do we have in that parable that Jesus told? He says to his disciples, a rich man is accused of wasting his possessions. He calls him in and says, you're about to be fired. Give an account of your management. You're about to be fired. And the manager says to himself, there's no way I can dig. I'm not strong enough to do manual work, and neither am I humble enough to want to sit by the side of a road with a begging bowl. So I'm going to lose my job, and this is my plan. Now, if you look at the figures in his plan, you'll see that there's a great deal of wealth involved here. So he's halving for some who owe him. I can't imagine the value of 900 gallons of olive oil. It seems an awful lot. So for some, he's reducing by 50%, others by 20%. And at the end of it, the master calls him in again. And you would expect the master to be very angry. But if we look at verse 8, we see that the master commended the dishonest manager because he'd acted shrewdly. Now that is a surprise. And Jesus, over those 2 verses, has a few points which we're going to look at a little bit more closely in just a second or two. And then Jesus goes on to talk about being trusted. He goes on to talk about serving 2 masters. He talks about money, he talks about wealth, and he talks about serving God. You know, we're going to sing, I think, after the message now, this life is not my own. That's an important concept, isn't it? So I want to start, there are 3 R's this morning, and I want to start with reckoning, and that's verse 8a, and it's the master's commendation. The master commended the dishonest manager because he'd acted shrewdly. Now, this is at the reckoning when he calls him in. And we know as God's people that we are called to give an account of how we have served him. And I want to stress that if you look at it carefully, the master is not praising the manager for his dishonesty. But we do have, I think, a somewhat comic situation, really, where the master praises this unscrupulous manager, but he actually is praising him for his cleverness. Prudent self-interest, we might say. He has to admit that the manager's plan to make provision for himself after he's lost his job is certainly original and I think by implication successful. And we might say that this guy may be an absolute rascal, but he's a very clever one. Over years, I've conducted lots of funerals and spoken to lots of people, lots of families who wanted a funeral in the church, even though in many cases it was their church, but they hadn't been there for about 40 years. It was not unusual. I think probably a couple of dozen times, people have said to me, "Oh, he was a real larrikin." It's sort of real Aussie thing, isn't it? The larrikin thing. And I know then what to expect. It somehow means that this guy really trod that edge between good and bad. And I would get, look, he wasn't a bad man, but he was just a larrikin. And I think maybe you could describe this manager a bit like that too. I suspect that the people whose debts have been reduced probably were very happy with him, but maybe they even thought the manager had sanctioned all this, so it would put him in a favorable light too, which may just explain why the manager is commending him for his cleverness. When Jesus uses the word reckoning, it's a metaphor really for the final judgment. So when he speaks to the Pharisees, for instance, in Matthew chapter 12, he says, "I tell you, everyone will have to give an account on the day of judgment for every empty word they have spoken." It's verse 36 of chapter 12 of Matthew. Everyone will have to give an account. And Paul, much the same sort of idea to the Romans. Each of us will give an account of ourselves to God, he says, before the judgment seat. We're not called by Jesus to imitate the manager's dishonesty in our dealings, but we are called on to imitate his shrewdness, his rather resourceful wisdom. And probably the best single sentence commentary that Jesus ever provided is in Matthew chapter 10, when Jesus sends out the 12, and it's verse 16 for those that want to follow. He sends out the 12, and he says to them, "Be as shrewd as snakes and as innocent as doves." You remember that? So he's not saying be as cunning and deceitful as snakes and as stupid as doves. He's saying as shrewd as snakes, as innocent as doves. And the master's praise for this man is, the Greek word is phronimos, and it means wisely or shrewdly. That's what the praise is for. Act wisely, act shrewdly in dealings of business and in dealings with the world. Because our aim, I take it, is to stand before God on Judgment Day and for him to say to us, "Well done, good and faithful." Reckoning. But then we have resources, our second R, and that's the second half of verse 8. The people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. Now, to prepare for this reckoning, we are prudent in our use of our resources. We are shrewd, especially, I think, in the area of finances. Jesus did talk a lot about finance. He talked a lot about possessions. He talked a lot about money. And he contrasts the people of this world and the people of the light. This world, the implication is that the dealings are often local, maybe a little bit underhand, shrewd, but maybe a little bit murky in their dealings with their own kind. That's the implication of what's being said. At one level, we might call it streetwise. Whereas, he says, the children of the light, they can be a little bit naive, a little bit gullible, a little bit unwise. Is that so? I'm just telling you what Jesus says. So the challenge is, how can we as God's people act wisely without being deceitful and dishonest? How do we use our resources then? Well, an example might be, I had a very wise and a very shrewd youth worker a few years ago, and having seen him, he was a rapper, and he had this bin box, like a normal garbage bin, and it had a speaker in it, and he would play this and he would rap. And I found him in Melbourne at the bottom of Swanston Street one day with a little bit of a crowd around him, and he was doing this for the gospel. And then I found him just round the corner from the church on Clarendon Street in South Melbourne. There he is, rapping away, and some people are really quite appreciating what he's doing, right, with a Christian message he's got. And then I got a phone call. And the phone call is from the local council member, who happens to be a friend of mine, and I'm very thankful that she chose to phone me up first. And she said, "You do know that's illegal, don't you?" So what he was doing was he was certainly using his resources and an enthusiasm for the gospel, but not being particularly wise in his use of that. I guess that's why we have things like, working with children checks and all the rest of the stuff, to make sure that we're accountable before other people, and because we are concerned to act wisely. And we demonstrate then that wisdom in the world by our behavior in the work and the community, and I guess at home as well. And the question that Jesus moves to in the use of our resources is, are we motivated by ourselves, by self-improvement, by selfishness? Ultimately, are we motivated by greed, or are we motivated by what we do for the kingdom? And the biggest test is what we do with our money. Well, does anybody remember a guy called Ron Sider who wrote a book called Rich Christians in an Age of Hunger? It's a bit dated now, but he wrote this. He said, in 1 year, Nike paid Michael Jordan as much for promoting its shoes as they paid the entire 18,000 workforce in Indonesia. But as believers, that's the world. That's not how we are. We're called to use our resources wisely in our dealings with each other and in our dealings with what Jesus calls the people of this world, as we use our resources for the kingdom. Well, the third R comes just in the next verse, verse 9, which is probably even more tricky, and it's rewards. I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that when it's gone, you'll be welcomed into eternal dwellings. Did you notice at the beginning of that parable that Jesus is talking to his disciples? If you look at the beginning of the previous chapter, chapter 15, he's talking to tax collectors and sinners and Pharisees and teachers of the law. And those are those very famous parables, which I'm not going to talk about, which are to do with things like the lost sheep and the lost coin and the prodigal son and so on. Next chapter, 16, Jesus is speaking to his disciples. Now, that doesn't mean that the Pharisees aren't listening in, because by the time we get to chapter 14, it appears they've been listening to what he's been telling his disciples. But it is addressing disciples, not a mix of people in the same way. So Jesus is talking to his followers. He's talking to people like us. He's not talking to unbelievers and telling them that they can use their money to earn salvation. He's rather telling his followers to bear fruit that demonstrates their repentance, especially in the areas of worldly resources and wealth. And he simply means by worldly wealth, belongings and money. Verse 9. Is it telling us to use money to buy friendship? You know, like the proverbial lonely child in the school playground who gives out lollies hoping he'll make friends that way. What he's saying is, use your material resources, use your money for the sake of the kingdom. Have that priority. It doesn't contradict salvation by God's grace. But what it does say is that true faith brings action. And I'm sure that many of you, or most of you probably, are familiar with the words of James in chapter 2, 14. What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but has no deeds? Can such faith save them? Suppose a brother or sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to them, go in peace, keep warm and well fed, but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it? In the same way, faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead. And that's just the sort of thing that Jesus is saying. John says the same in his first letter and chapter 3. He says the same sort of thing too. If anyone has material possessions and sees a brother or sister in need, but has no pity on them, how can the love of God be in that person? Let us not love with words or speech, but with actions and in truth. The very next parable, after a few verses in the same chapter of Luke, start at verse 19, is called the rich man and Lazarus, in some versions Dives and Lazarus, and it illustrates the wrong use of material possessions and the eternal consequences of that. So we use our resources to support one another, and we use our resources to win and disciple believers, so indeed we'll be welcomed into our eternal dwellings by those who are there already. Now that's tricky. I might put it this way. Those believers who show unselfish and generous love will be welcomed into eternal dwellings by the faithful who've gone before. The contrast, by sort of analogy in this parable, is that the manager in his dealings with what they call the world, the manager is welcomed into worldly houses of fellow sinners. That's the sort of analogy, yeah? Though that, of course, is temporary rather than eternal. One of the things that we, I think, always need to remember is there's nothing in the New Testament about how much of our income we give. What we do read, and you've seen a bit of it in 2 Corinthians, is generosity, cheerfulness, that wonderful Greek word hilaron, from which I guess we get our word hilarious, but it means cheerful. Cheerful and generous. And I know that there are many who still like to go with the idea of the tithe, the Old Testament principle of God giving God 10% of our income. But in fact, as stewards or managers of all we possess, we actually are not giving God 10%. Even if we're doing that, we are surely being responsible for 100%. We had that Old Testament reading from the first book of Chronicles, and in history this is David, King David, giving up his kingship in the favor of his son Solomon, and it's an appeal to the people to use their resources for the building of the temple, because David won't build the temple, but it's a bit like collecting resources, collecting money, collecting goods, and so on. And David's prayer about bringing gifts for building the temple is this. Let me remind you. Who am I and who are my people that we should be able to give as generously as this? Everything comes from you, and we've given you only what comes from your hand. We are foreigners and strangers in your sight, as were all our ancestors. Our days on earth are like a shadow without hope. Lord our God, all this abundance that we've provided for building you a temple for your holy name comes from your hand, and all of it belongs to you. Now, that was a prayer that many clergy, well, including me, do you remember the days when a collection plate used to be passed around? Yeah? Everybody stood at the front and sort of presented them, and sometimes the minister would say a prayer, yeah? And the one I often used was this one. All things come of you, O Lord, and of your own have we given you. Straight from 1 Chronicles chapter 29. It's verse 14. Everything comes from you, and we have given you only what comes from your hand. How the church uses its its income, its finances, how the church uses that, how individual believers manage their income is surely a key demonstration to the world then of true saving faith. And Jesus then concludes with this phrase, you can't serve both God and money. I guess our manager in our parable uses his considerable wisdom, prudence, shrewdness is a favorite word by commentators, shrewdness, which are all very commendable. He uses all that ultimately to serve himself. And to be honest, we might just feel some sympathy for that. The poor guy's lost his income and his job. But the final question then is, who do you serve? Who do you serve? And I hope and pray that we would say that we serve God himself, the one that we know through our Lord Jesus Christ, but that actually affects our lives, how we manage our resources, and particularly money. That we are generous, that we are cheerful in our giving, that we are honest but shrewd as God's stewards.